I used to think betrayal came like a thunderclap loud, impossible to miss. It doesn't. It comes as a soft click of a latch at 2 a.m., a whisper you're not meant to hear, a kiss exchanged in the wrong doorway. One day before my son's beach wedding, I watched the bride-to-be slip out of my ex-husband's room with her silk robe askew, and the life I had stitched back together with careful seams split open. I didn't scream. I recorded. Then I walked to my son's room and knocked. My name is Elena, and I married charm before I understood the cost. Richard could sell ice to a glacier tall, silver-haired, with a grin that made good judgment evaporate. I was 22, pregnant, and floating through a wedding like a sleepwalker. For 5 years, I mistook his attention for devotion until the affair math no longer added up my best friend Sarah, my cousin Lisa, and a constellation of names that sounded like a dare. Richard believed fidelity was a suggestion. I believed promises were binding. So I filed for divorce and raised our boy, Daniel. While Richard reinvented himself as a part-time father with full-time theatrics, he missed school recitals and birthdays, then swooped in with grand gestures, college paid in full, a shiny car at 16, designer this and that, teaching Daniel that love arrives in glossy boxes with receipts. I was the woman who reminded him that love also shows up at 6 a.m. with cough syrup and sits through parent-teacher conferences on a Tuesday. When I warned Daniel what kind of man his father was, he heard only bitterness. He saw generosity. I saw hush money with a bow. Enter Samantha Williams, tall, blonde, impeccable, drifting through rooms like a magazine page come to life. Her family's last name opened country club doors, and their smiles could have been printed by a luxury brand. Only later did I learn those doors were rented and the smiles propped up by debt. To Daniel, she looked like the future. To me, she looked at me the way people look at a smudge on glass, politely, with instructions to disappear. She never raised her voice or forgot her manners, but her micro-expressions did the shouting. She touched Richard's forearm a shade too often, laughed at his stories a pitch too high, and angled herself toward him in conversations as if gravity favored his side of the room. I told myself I was paranoid. Experience is a cruel cosmetic. It makes suspicion look like jealousy. Daniel planned a 3-day resort wedding by the ocean white chairs on sand, roses braided into an arch, golden hour vows at 5 p.m. They had already signed the civil paperwork in town with a tidy prenuptial agreement Daniel's family lawyer insisted upon. Routine protection, he called it. And I nodded, grateful for one solid plank in a sea of pageantry. On Friday night, the welcome dinner looked like a catalog. Samantha curated the evening as if perfection were a sport. I watched my son glide table to table, handsome, charming, generous, and felt both proud and uneasy. Across the room, Samantha and Richard floated in a bubble of familiarity that didn't belong to them. Sleep dodged me. At 2 a.m., I left my room to breathe salt air and quiet my thoughts. Near Richard's suite, I heard a woman's breathy murmur. Reflex told me to keep walking. History told me to look. The door cracked. Samantha emerged, hair mussed, robe crooked. The unmistakable afterglow of a line crossed and then crossed again. Richard stood in the doorway shirtless, satisfied, gentle in the way he reserved for his latest conquest. They spoke in whispers about comfort, goodbyes, and real life beginning tomorrow. I fumbled my phone into record just as she lifted to kiss him with the kind of finality that says everything words should not. When their doors shut, I stood in the hallway shaking, a statue carved from fury and disbelief. I knocked on Daniel's door. He opened on the third try, frowning, hair tousled. The boy I had watched sleep after fevers, now a man about to be broken. I told him. He demanded proof. I gave him the video, and then I watched him fall and rearrange himself in minutes. Confusion, denial, horror. Then a cold focus I had never seen in his face. His hands trembled, his jaw did not. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "Leave it to me." He closed the door gently and then with force, the wood rattling as if the room itself agreed. Morning split the sky as if nothing had happened. Samantha sparkled at breakfast, laughing with her bridesmaids, asking me if I was ready for the most perfect day. Richard strolled in late, kissed her hand theatrically, and asked if she'd slept well. I excused myself before my coffee became a weapon. Meanwhile, Daniel was calm, too calm, with a composure that started to worry me more than any outburst could. The hotel bloomed with flowers and choreographed chaos, makeup brushes, steaming gowns, speeches rehearsed in corners. The ocean waited as though it hadn't heard a secret at 2 a.m. By late afternoon, the beach was a postcard, white chairs squared against an endless blue, a floral arch like a doorway to a life we all pretended was within reach. I sat front row in navy, my smile tightened to a seam. Daniel walked the aisle alone, midnight blue suit blending with the sky at 5 p.m., the ocean tossing silver coins of light at his feet. When his eyes found mine, he gave the smallest nod, a flick of signal light from a ship charting a dangerous inlet. The music changed. Samantha floated toward him in lace and silk, ethereal, radiant, each step a thread binding her to a ceremony she believed belonged to her. Richard delivered her hand to my son's, leaned in, whispered something that made her smile, and took his place like a proud benefactor at a gala. The officiant began to speak about love and promise and the miracle of choosing one another. I tried to breathe. The waves kept time. The vows began like a script we all knew by heart, each phrase polished by tradition and repeated against the hush of the sea. When the officiant invited anyone with objections to speak, the silence felt like a held breath. Then he turned to Daniel and asked the question every love story depends on. My son looked at Samantha for a long, distilled moment, and some of the color drained from her face under all that luminous makeup. He smiled, but it was the cool, decisive smile I had seen at 2 a.m. "No," he said, voice even, carrying cleanly across the wind. "I don't." The sound after the words was not sound at all. The whole beach caught in a stunned pause, then a ripple of gasps and the confused rustle of silk and breath. Samantha's lips parted, a half-formed laugh searching for a different explanation. "Daniel," she whispered, barely moving. "This isn't funny." He kept his eyes on her, unflinching. "What's not funny," he said, "is a bride leaving my father's room at 2 a.m. The wave broke. Guests turned, phones lifted, murmurs rose like gulls. Richard straightened in his chair and composed his face into paternal disappointment. "Son," he started. "Let's not." Daniel held up a hand, then his phone. "Do I need to play the video?" The threat hung there, a thin wire humming in the air. Samantha's bouquet slipped from her fingers and thudded into the sand. "Lies," she tried, the word collapsing as it left her mouth. Richard stood, smoothing his charcoal suit, jaw set. "You're humiliating yourself," he said, walking toward the altar. "Enough." Daniel laughed once, without warmth. "If humiliation is contagious, you brought the outbreak." He glanced at the officiant poor friend with a temporary ordination, blinking like a deer in stage lights, and then back at Samantha. "You remember the civil ceremony last week," he said. "We're already legally married. And you remember the prenuptial agreement you signed." She nodded reflexively before she could stop herself. "It includes a clause about infidelity during the engagement period." He continued, "Consequences attached. You invoked them at 2 a.m. Richard closed the remaining distance with the practiced swagger of a man who has won too many arguments by being louder. He reached for Daniel's shoulder, an old dominance play. My son stepped aside and, with a controlled right hook that was more punctuation than fury, caught him on the jaw. Richard toppled backward into the sand, stunned more by the optics than the pain. There was no brawl, only a crisp boundary written in the language men recognize. "Approach me again like that," Daniel said, voice low, "and you'll find I've learned more from you than you intended." Chaos bloomed. Bridesmaids fluttered. Someone sobbed. A champagne bottle hissed open for emergency courage that failed to arrive. The officiant tried to murmur something conciliatory about taking a moment, but the moment had already taken us. Samantha swayed, then sank to her knees, train pooling like spilled milk around her. "Daniel, we can fix this," she pleaded, mascara carving dark tributaries along her cheeks. "It was a mistake. I was scared." "You were not talking someone out of cold feet," Daniel said softly, "and fear doesn't explain a kiss like that." He did not raise his voice. That was the cruelty of it, or the mercy. He kept his tone gentle while he dismantled the lie, as if sparing her one last indignity. A guest shouted that the police should be called, for what Daniel asked without looking away from Samantha. Bad taste. He pocketed the phone. There will be lawyers enough, not for a fight, just for paperwork. As for today, the bar is open. He turned to the officiant, who had discovered new depths of silence. "I think we're done." And with that, he walked down the aisle alone the way he had come, a groom without a wedding, trailed by the buzzing cloud of people who suddenly remembered they had opinions. I found him later on the balcony outside the reception hall, the sun lowering itself into the water at 6:30 p.m., turning the ocean into hammered copper. He loosened his tie and leaned on the railing as if it had offered him a private truce. For a moment, he looked young again, my feverish boy drifting to sleep at 8 p.m. after medicine and a story. But then the light shifted, and the man returned. I stood beside him without speaking. He let out a breath. "Thank you," he said, "for waking me, for not yelling, for trusting me to do it my way. I swallowed the arguments I had rehearsed all morning. I wanted to protect you. I managed, but I had to trust you." He nodded. "I called the lawyer at 3 a.m., he admitted. "Emergency line. He confirmed what the clause allows if I choose to enforce it. I chose." The wind braided salt into our hair, and the shouted fragments from inside dimmed to a harmless buzz. "Do you feel better?" I asked. He considered. "No, but I feel clean," he said. "There's a difference." He rolled his shoulder, testing the memory of his own punch. "Dad will bluster," he added, almost gently. "He needs an audience to feel tall." I took it away. We watched the water go dark at its edges, from somewhere deeper in the resort. Music faltered, stalled, then moved on to a different playlist, as if the building had decided to skip to another track. Samantha passed below us on the path, flanked by 2 bridesmaids carrying her train as if custom still mattered. She looked up once. Our eyes met. There was no hatred in hers, only the dull, bewildered grief of someone who has finally calculated the bill for a long spree. She did not speak, and neither did we. At 7 p.m., the first stars appeared. Daniel straightened. "I'll start the filings on Monday," he said. "I won't drag it out. I just want it done." I nodded. "Come home tonight," I said. "We'll order takeout, sit on the floor like we used to, and be quiet." The corner of his mouth lifted. "No champagne, only sparkling water," I said. "The kind that stings and tells the truth." The divorce papers moved faster than anyone expected, not because Samantha agreed, but because the prenup made Resistance a theater production with no curtain call. Within 3 months, the ink was dry. Her family's name dragged through court transcripts and whispered gossip. She tried to argue coercion, intimidation, misunderstanding, anything that might soften the legal weight pressing her down. But then Daniel's lawyer produced the video, grainy hotel hallway lighting, capturing her silk robe and Richard's familiar smirk. Even the judge winced. It wasn't just evidence. It was a portrait of self-destruction. Samantha left the courtroom without a fortune, without even dignity. Her reputation folded into the tabloids like a cheap accessory. Richard fared no better. He tried apology, first bouquets on my porch, texts that began with, "I know I messed up," and ended with pleas to explain. When apology failed, he shifted to outrage. He threatened lawsuits, muttered about betrayal, insisted Samantha had seduced him in some haze of vulnerability. But Richard's power had always depended on silence, on women keeping secrets to preserve appearances. Now the secret lived on everyone's phones, ready to resurface at any moment. He became a man who entered rooms and found conversations already aware of his weakness. For someone who thrived on image, it was its own kind of exile. Daniel surprised me. I expected him to collapse, to retreat, to let cynicism calcify around his heart. Instead, he built. He threw himself into work, traveled, came home with stories about deserts in Morocco and mountains in Peru, snapshots that looked more like freedom than distraction. I needed to see myself somewhere else, he told me once over dinner, without Dad's shadow, without her reflection. He dated lightly, but always with a kind of respectful distance, as if testing whether the ground could hold before he stepped fully. For the first time since he was a boy, he looked like he belonged to himself. 6 months later, on a warm evening in June, I sat on my porch with coffee when my neighbor Susan leaned across the railing. "How's your son?" she asked carefully. "After all that." She didn't finish. The town still carried the story like a pebble in its shoe. I smiled. He's better than I ever expected. And it was true. Divorce had stripped him, but also clarified him. He had become less tolerant of lies, more deliberate in his choices. He even ignored Richard's calls, a boundary I had begged him to set for years, watching him. I realize sometimes pain doesn't just scar, it recalibrates. As for Samantha, last I heard she was back in her parents' house. The so-called Williams Empire revealed as a facade of loans and desperation. All those dinners, gowns, and country club afternoons had been a stage set crumbling behind her. Her fall was not just personal, it was financial. And while a part of me wanted to clutch anger like armor, another part only felt weary sympathy. People do reckless things when the ground beneath them gives way. She had gambled on my son to be her salvation. Instead, she lit her own bridge and watched it burn. Richard tried once more, showing up uninvited at my door with a bottle of wine and a speech about second chances. I didn't even let him finish. Some bridges aren't just burned, they're booby-trapped, waiting for the fool who tries to cross again. I closed the door, and for the first time in years, I felt no guilt about the silence that followed. My life had been spent cleaning up his wreckage. I wasn't going to spend its remainder handing him bandages. Then came the letter. Daniel called me one evening, voice steady but softer than usual. She wrote to me. He said, "Samantha." My chest tightened. What did she want to apologize? He answered. She says she's in therapy now, working on what she calls destructive patterns. She wanted me to know she did love me, that it wasn't about me. It was about her fear, her emptiness. He paused. It's strange. Reading it, I felt relieved. Not because it changes anything, but because maybe I can stop thinking it was all my fault. I listened, proud of him in a way that almost hurt. You don't owe her forgiveness, I reminded. He chuckled. I know, but I think I owe myself the freedom of not carrying her anymore. I hung up later and sat with the thought. Life rarely gives us neat justice. What happened at that altar was not just scandal, it was a mirror forcing each of us to look. Daniel learned strength. Samantha learned consequence. Richard learned nothing, which was its own punishment. And me, I learned that instincts ignored will always return with teeth. That night in the hotel hallway, shaking behind a pillar, I thought I was powerless. I wasn't. Recording the truth? Telling my son? Stepping back when he asked me to, it all added up to something like courage. We think revenge is spectacle, but sometimes it's simply refusing to be blind again. When I tell this story now, people always ask if I enjoyed watching Samantha collapse in her wedding dress. The honest answer, yes. But the deeper answer is that satisfaction fades. What stays is the lesson you cannot build forever on secrets. And if betrayal comes at 2 a.m. in the form of a kiss in the wrong doorway, the dawn will expose it eventually. My son's wedding ended in chaos, but his life began again in clarity. Mine did too, and perhaps that is enough. If you've listened this far, thank you. Stories like this remind us that strength is often born in the moments we least want to face. If it resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truths hiding in plain sight. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about what you'd have done if you were in my shoes.